What happens when self-defense is against the law? What happens when the protectors become the predators? What happens when innocents are betrayed? Imagine that 2/3 of all Americans disappear. 170 million people. Or that the countries of Germany, France, and Spain are virtually wiped off the map. 170 million people gone. In the 20th century, that's how many innocents were slaughtered, tortured, starved, mutilated, worked to death, bayoneted, hanged, annihilated at the hands of their governments. They had no means to defend themselves.
Some may consider the position of this film a little extreme. They may think that the idea of personal self-defense against a killer government is an extreme idea. But in fact, if you look at the history of the world, and certainly the history of the 20th century, you look at the nations where the people had power, they weren't persecuted by their own government. If you look at the nations where the people didn't have power, they were subject to persecution. And in genocide after genocide in this film, we show exactly how that took place. This film does have a message. It has a moral of the story, as it were. It's a connection of three ideas: betrayal of trust, vicious cowardice, and powerlessness of victims. Any individual who acts in some way to try to stop people from protecting themselves, any individual who would work to disarm people, and oftentimes that's known as gun control, the idea that a person should not have the tools to defend themselves. Anyone who is willing to be part of the process of rendering the citizens defenseless is to blame. The Founding Fathers fully expected that Americans would be prepared at all times to fight a government. When the government becomes the enemy of the people, the Founding Fathers fully expected that the people would rise up against that government. It's right there in the literature. Alexander Hamilton wrote about it in Federalist Paper number 29. James Madison, considered the father of our Constitution, wrote about it in Federalist Paper number 46. They expressly expected that people would take to arms and stop a government that went too far. So they built into the Constitution, the Second Amendment, to be sure that Americans would never become the disarmed subjects of this government, to make sure this government never became a killer government, and to make sure that the scenes we saw in this film never could take place in America. Every American, maybe everyone in the world, but every American who has any interest at all in the future of a free nation, of a safe nation, of a prosperous nation, should also be a person who's interested in how to preserve that kind of nation. And the way to preserve that is to never give anybody more power than the people have. The warning sign on the horizon now is this drift in America and in Western civilization to downplaying the importance of self-defense, the downplaying that key value. And that's what this film is trying to get across, is that self-defense is the job of the individual. It's not the job of the authorities all the time. The individual ultimately has the duty and the right. And as we see Western civilization moving away from that, trying to centralize the defense of a society and take away the power from the people to do that, this movie shows the history of what happens to people who've been rendered powerless. There are about three things that we can't really do with this documentary. One of them is to communicate the impact of actually being there. We show still photographs and footage, but it doesn't really get across what it's like to be in the presence of brutal murder, what it's like to see the dead eyes of the killers in the killing squads, what it's like to see the panic and feel the fear in a persecution and an extermination. We can't give you that right there up close and personal. Another thing that we can't really get across is the sense of time. Again, we have short photos and video that people can see, but we can't give you the sense of what it's like to live day after day in dread and fear in a persecution, the endlessness of living in a prison camp, or the lifetime of scars, nightmares, and phobias that survivors live through. That sense of time, we just can't get it across as well as we'd like. Another thing is the pain of mind, the thoughts in the mind of a survivor, for example, who would replay over and over in his head, I wish I'd seen the warning signs. I wish I could have done something about this. I wish I'd had a weapon. I wish I could have fought back. I wish I could have protected my family members who were killed or persecuted. That pain of mind never goes away.
As a kid growing up in Tucson, Arizona, I was raised by my grandmother. Most of her friends were Holocaust survivors. And I learned at an early age that there was always something very wrong with the picture, if I can put it that way. You always saw stacks of bodies at the death camps, but none of those bodies were holding a gun. But next to the bodies, you might see a Nazi soldier holding a gun. So it became pretty obvious to me, and perhaps in my Arizona environment, that a lack of being able to defend one's life had an awful lot to do with making it possible for governments to kill you. I thought this was a story that had to be told. It's a story that most people do not understand. It's a history lesson that most people are not getting in school. And the best way to tell people in America is to make a visual presentation instead of expecting them to read a book. So we set out on telling people information that lots of folks would rather they not know, and among them are folks who are supporting gun control schemes. And we wanted people to understand the downside of gun control, the side of gun control you never hear about on the 6 o'clock news. And to bring all this information together over the years and be able to put it into a visual presentation was not only a fascinating experience, but I think we finally have put the right package together to help people see that how evil gun control is. No longer do they have to read a book now to see the foundation of a genocide, the steps that are taken. No longer do they have to read books, although I wish they would, but to grasp the big picture. It's all here now. It's within the film. I think this documentary has the potential to save lots of lives. And it may only be about an hour long, but it's an hour that can change the course of human civilization, in my opinion. Because the more people who understand how the game is played, if I can phrase it that way, the more people who understand how dictatorships come into power, I think, and the more people that we can convince to be armed, and then I think the more people we'll be able to save. And if we can save more human lives, then that means there'll be more people who will be able to control government. And never again will people fear their government. And that's a key to preventing future genocides. I'm hoping the people who decide to watch this film are those that are concerned about the preservation of life. People who realize that they are their own first line of self-defense, people who do not want to be victims by an oppressive government, people who are opposed to police states, dictatorships, tyrannies, people who really care about their families. I hope that people who will already believe in gun ownership will watch this documentary so that they can tell others about the evils of gun control schemes. They can help others understand how horrors happen to people who are defenseless. Well, my goal for the people who see this film is to help them have the knowledge, the information of the history of gun control and how it has been so horrible and how it has brought about so many tyrannies and police states and dictatorships and, of course, genocide. And I think that people need to think about how horrible these situations have been. And I ask people to imagine a world that is free from genocide. And then imagine a world that because there is no gun control, there is no death by government. You know, producing this documentary had some high points and some low points. And one of the most disheartening areas was dealing with so-called humanitarian groups. They always go to the public and say, gee, we want to help save lives, send us money. And when we went to one of these large humanitarian groups, the United Nations, and asked to use some of their photographs of Rwanda and Uganda, they initially said yes, but then they realized that we were opposed to gun control, and they made it very clear they would not work with us because we believe in the preservation of firearms ownership. And so my message to people concerning humanitarian groups is that if you want to give them money, well, that's all well and good, but maybe you should just ask what their position is on firearms ownership, because most of them do support victim disarmament policies that make police states, dictatorships, and genocide possible. Well, I think there's a very clear message in this film for American military personnel, and it's a message that they unfortunately don't get in high school before they go into service. And I'm not so sure it's even a message they get while they're in the military. But one of the reasons American military personnel are put in harm's way by being sent to foreign lands is that the people in those lands fear their government because they can't control their government. Their government has gone bad. Their government may be killing them. And all of this came about largely because the people are defenseless, which means they don't have access to firearms. I think September 11th was a good example of the uselessness and the futility of gun control laws. When you think about how several hate-filled terrorists were able to take over airplanes using box cutters and pocket knives, and they got away with it. They were able to murder thousands of people because no one on these planes was able to defend their life. No one had a gun. And I think that this is a lesson that is not being learned in America or throughout the world. If you want to stop criminals, you have to speak to criminals in a language they understand. And if they want to be violent against you, you have to use violence against them. And I think that governments do get scared. And it's dangerous for people because when governments get scared, they do scary things. And that's what we have seen time and time again throughout history. The communists were afraid of the people. The Nazis were afraid of the people. Every dictator, every police state, every tyranny fears the people. And so people should always be very fearful of government. There's a saying, that an armed society is a polite society. I grew up in an armed society in the Arizona desert, and it was very polite. And so there's a lot of truth to that expression. And I think that America would be a lower crime country, if I can put it that way, that the people in America would be safer if they were able to defend themselves.
יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך, ישתבח, יתפאר, יתרומם, יתנשא, יתהדר, ויתעלה, ויתעלה, שמי דקול אישה בריחו, לילה מיני כל ברכתה, ושיר